So in this episode, it's all about show me the money, effectively, or where is the money coming from? In our world, it's also known as source of funds and source of wealth, which we briefly touched on in the previous episode. I'm pleased again to have Luke here, Luke Haddon from Keystone Law, and Mike from Strathern. Thank you ever so much for joining us again. So I think the world of source of funds and source of wealth has got probably a little bit trickier over the last couple of years, the information that you guys need to gather. What does a good source of funds or source of wealth process look like? I know it fits into the wider policy with regards to risk and AML, but it's a pretty tricky subject, because asking someone where their wealth or where their money is coming from is a tricky question, and it's a bit personal as well. So I think any fee earner, I would be if I was a fee earner, would be a bit uncomfortable in asking that question. Where does the money come from? So that's what today's episode is about, source of funds and how well it fits into processes and frameworks. And Mike, I know in your firm, the source of funds and source of wealth does fit into a broader framework or a broader risk framework. But how has that evolved over time? And is it more complex than it ever has been?
I think the perception is that it's more complex, and I've been working I've been in the legal sector for 5 years, and pretty much over that time I've been trying to show firms that it can be simpler. We talked earlier about the 6-month bank statements, just chuck everything in the kitchen sink at getting lots and lots and lots of documents. But I think that then puts fee earners into that vicious cycle of they're getting lots, they're having to review lots, they're generating lots of questions, they have to get answers to lots of questions, and then that creates a sort of falseness of where we're having to inquire too much into clients' backgrounds and things like that, whereas actually it can be, I think anyway, it can be a lot more surgical, it can be a lot more precise, and actually fewer, more pointed questions get to the answer faster. Yeah. But that's an uncomfortable space for people to get into if they've been practicing for 20 years and they've been used to give me 3 months, give me 6 months, give me 12 months, to actually say, no, don't do that anymore. Do this instead. That it can feel daunting and it can feel more complicated, because actually what you're saying is the ways in which you can navigate it are all these different ways, and given flexibility, I think naturally makes people think that it is harder, when actually what we're trying to do is ultimately make it easier for them, a bit more pragmatic, a little bit more flexible. So, I mean, overall, I think, generally speaking, it's not really changed. It's not got much harder. But I think the feeling is that it's got harder because we're trying to make it better.
Yeah. The regulations haven't changed since 2017 in this space. But it's all about what the reasonable measures are that you're expected to apply to the situation at hand. And what the sectoral guidance is in that space has now developed far greater than where anyone, I think, initially thought it might be back in 2017. What that means, I tend to see, is that actually it is around that mindset, is getting lawyers engaged with what are we trying to prove here, which is not just what bank account is this other funds coming to us from, or showing that there are funds within the account more generally. It's painting the wider picture and explaining why it's reasonable to arrive at a place of this is why it makes sense, this is why these funds are clean. And practically that's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. It's around an explanation that we don't have suspicion or knowledge that these funds are criminal. And I think this is where the risk-based approach absolutely has to come into your day-to-day practice as a law firm, is dedicate your time, dedicate your resource allocation to those really difficult ones where you do have to look into it. I think solicitors or advocates generally have this reputation as being professional enablers. I've yet to see any case where solicitors as a whole are wittingly going into this to pull the wool over the eyes of the kind of sector as a whole, facilitating any money laundering. But we understand what we're doing here. It's fitting into that. It's assessing that we are financial financial crime fighters in this space, and doing the best we can.
I think that's a really good point as well, because you look at the SRA enforcement action, and I don't think a solicitor's ever actually been done for any of the offences under POCA or anything like that. It's always about failure to implement, controls, policies, procedures, to do the due diligence, to do what they're supposed to be doing in accordance with the regs, rather than actually committing one of these offences, yeah.
It will be interesting with the FCA coming in, or notionally coming in. We're not still quite sure whether it's going to happen, but what their enforcement strategy will be in this, or whether it will be a case of actually guiding regulated practices in this space to just improve what they're doing, bringing them up to better standards, in a case of, well, actually, if you raise the kind of standards more generally across the board, you should be protecting the wider economy from the effects that might be there.
Yeah. And I think just on that point around enforcement action, when you actually dig into some of the reports that you get on the back of enforcement action, it's not actually necessarily because there has been a direct breach of the regulations. It's been an indirect breach caused by the fact that you've documented what your risk-based approach is, and that sets the bar up here, but actually you're falling short of your own standard. So by not having, your policy set at the right level, you're creating regulatory breaches that you could avoid by being a little bit more realistic about what you can achieve, and not aiming for that perfection standard. Aim for passable, and you can maybe just save yourself a bit of heartache.
Exactly. And on that note then, Luke, what does a robust source of funds / wealth actually look like? What is good practice? Or are there minimums, I suppose? Are there minimums? Are there good practice? What does it actually look like?
For me, every client is different, every matter is different, and your approach has to differ with that as well. I think one of the really difficult things that I find day to day is training our lawyers on what is an appropriate source of funds approach for the matters on which they are instructed. Because lawyer A can be doing exactly the same deal to lawyer B, same value, same property, maybe not same property, but same purchase values, but how they might want to go about that will differ just according to what they know about their client and building out that wider profile. You could say to them, okay, go out and get 6 months worth of bank statements, but if you know that client A is, well, what you shouldn't be doing is knowing that client A is up to no good as part of that, you're going to ask for a lot more. You're going to ask for them to explain, and document verification will be at a far higher standard than it might be for someone who's been working for Goldman Sachs for 5 years and has distributions and wealth generally more built out as part of that. You can't apply a blanket policy as to this is what good looks like here. It's about engaging people and wanting them to speak to you in the right way to understand how they might want to approach it in a defensible way. It's defensibility that we're looking at here, as being able to put something in front of the regulator or in front of your auditor one day to say, well, our policy more generally isn't as specific, but this is what we do, and this is what we did. And this is why I think it was defensible at that time. And it's far harder then for the regulator to say, no, it wasn't. They might still try it, but that's where your insurers come in and panel firms.
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing as well is the gut feeling as well. If you smell something's off, then ask more questions. Because usually, you guys have been doing this for a very, very long time. You can smell when something's off. So ask more questions, I think. So, if a transaction has come in from a foreign country, where is that money come from? Why is it coming to the bank account? And it's just about, it's almost like being an investigator as well, isn't it? When you're looking at the source of funds and source of wealth.
I think that's really interesting, Rhian. I think it's the way our AML training meets the standards, but it's about what we want the lawyers to take out of it, which is that they are not subject matter experts in AML. They are not or anti-financial crime generally. We're not expecting them to be. But what we're expecting them to know and to come to us with is when they get that funny feeling in their tummy. They might not be able to build their own framework around that we will be able to. But that's where we fit in as subject matter experts in this space, which is that, okay, well, these are the things you should be thinking about here. The fact that you've identified that initial red flag is the key thing here. And we're going to help you through that process as to either saying, well, yes, given this, you need to go out and get that. Or otherwise, actually, this is just non-starter from the beginning and we are better to kind of terminate and pull ourselves away from it.
I'm a big fan of contextual questions, so we are now starting to develop our training into looking at source of funds from sort of 3 perspectives to go information, where does your source of where is the sort of economic origin of the fund, tell us what that is, verification, and that's the document gathering bit that we all hate, but then there's that third bit for me which probably could form part of information, which is contextual questions. So if you ask the client, where did your money come from, and they say X, ask 2 or 3 more questions to build that context out, and that's where, you know, the general point around know your client, nature and purpose of the transaction and all that sort of thing really helps build that foundation for you to be able to get that gut feeling, because your instinct's only going to go off if you ask enough questions to trigger something for it to go off. So you really need to be moving away from saying, oh, where's it from? Here, right, okay, give me a bank statement, brilliant, and move on. You need to be a bit more inquisitive, and you did drop in a movie quote earlier on, so I'll do the same. The Ted Lasso quote when he's playing darts, and it's be curious. I think if I could encourage everyone just to be 5% more curious than they are now, you would probably find that you would glean a lot more from your client, which would help you identify the key risks and issues, but would probably mean you can write a better story and in turn reduce the overall time it's taken you to get through, because you can safely say, I've asked, they've told me this, I've followed up with this, and here's why I'm now comfortable. And it makes that process a bit easier and a bit more seamless.
We spoke earlier about the fact that because source of funds effectively is due diligence, client due diligence in the widest aspect. So many acronyms in the space. But it's the fact that actually it has to be informed by what your client matter risk assessment says initially, and more widely what your practice-wide risk assessment says. And joining the pieces together is to be able to say, well, actually, this is why we're going about this in the right way, as to build out, well, this is how you do it. This is how you kind of understand your client base as a whole and how we might want to approach it, without expending too much time or energy getting things that just not adding value in the wider picture building of where the funds come from.
Yeah, and we talked about that gut feeling and those sort of red flags earlier. Are there common red flags that you guys are looking for, or that you might see, or even red flags that generally get missed as well?
I think there's 36 of them or something, aren't there, that have been published red flags on areas that regulators have highlighted that should be a cause of concern for the fee earner or the matter principal. The things that should ring a bell and spark that curiosity and the additional questions into it. And if you're ignoring these red flags or these suspicious activity indicators and not overcoming them, you've got questions unanswered, and that will be problematic for your risk assessment.
But how do you train your lawyers to identify or know all 36 red flags? I think it goes back to that, having the right culture in place, that people feel that funny feeling in their tummy and speak out at the right time and go to you, me, Mike, and just generally build out, well, actually, I'm supported in this process. I think a big issue here is that people, especially with commercial pressures as well, they're not chasing down those leads as they should be doing, or chasing down those red flags and thinking, well, I need to sort this out, because commercial pressures are just there to move on to the next report that they need to produce.
And I think that's why the context is so important, because in practice, we're not going to train every solicitor on all the red flags. Yes, there's 36 potentially in property, but the LSAG section on red flags runs to 11 pages of bullet points after bullet points. So you're in the hundreds. So you're not reasonably going to expect people to be able to understand enough of those and the changes. So I mean, for me, it's very simply, is someone doing something that you wouldn't typically expect for your client. You know, you do lots of property transactions. If 90% of your clients do it this way, and this person's coming along and asking to do it a different way, that should be pause for thought. And as sensible adults who live our lives and have experiences, does it generally make sense? You know, are they coming to you and saying, I want to do this, I've asked my follow-up question, and you go, well, that's nonsense. That's the other bit where you should be reacting to and going, well, there might be an answer, there might be something plausible. At the very worst, it's because they're trying to do something and they're lying to me. But at the very least, it's, well, actually, I've not found out enough about my client yet. We've not got to, I've not got to the root, the genuine reason why they want to do this.
Anti-financial crime risk doesn't sit siloed in this either. It's your wider commercial risk as well. Like if someone is telling you, well, actually, we were meant to exchange in 3 weeks' time, but we're going to exchange today. Ignore the rest of the report. I just want to do it now. You have to be thinking about, well, actually, what this means in terms of your commercial risks down the line if you're held to be, well, actually, not guiding through that client through in the wider process, and they bring a claim against you. There can be no money laundering risk there at the end of the day. They just want it done because they've got a better deal. But if you treat things in silo, you're not protecting yourself more holistically.
And on that note, Mike, I suppose if one of your fee earners does get that gut feeling or does see a red flag, what is the escalation process? Like, who makes the final decision whether to continue to, you know, contract with this client? And what does that whole process look like? So I'm a fee earner, you know, I think something's come up with Luke, you know, and what is the escalation process from there on?
I mean, largely, most of the work is undertaken in partnership between the fee earner and the analyst who's allocated the matter. We tend to try for consistency to have one person to one client relationship, so that they build a relationship with the fee earner and they get to know the client as well. Most of the time, I find when something odd comes up, it's an explainable oddity. So they have discretion to go away and explore that themselves, and it's only when they get to the point to say, right, we've got the weird thing, we've asked, and we're still not satisfied, then it gets passed up the chain either to me directly, and sometimes I'll get involved and say, well, actually go away and ask further questions, and then the supervising partner tends to get involved in that point as well to say, well, actually, we need to think about this both from a POCA risk, do we want to disclose point of view, but we also need to think about it commercially. Do we want to continue with this relationship? Because we have the regulations to worry about, but we've also got, as Luke said, the commercials to go. Do we want to keep throwing good money at this transaction when there's low or no hope of actually getting to a point of satisfaction? So you need to have that sort of holistic view on it, with lots of eyes on it, looking at it from lots of different perspectives. And I would probably chuck in reputational risk into that as well, to go, there's commercial risk, there's regulatory risk, and then reputational risk to think about in that decision on what you do with a client.
I think we're in a different space here. Just on the reporting point you mentioned, Mike, as well, is that, conveyancing, absolutely in transactional reporting regime, but there can be other things that you are instructed upon where, quite frankly, there is no reporting that can be made if privilege applies in the right situation as well. Now, there's always questions about whether source of funds is typically privileged in the wider process, but I mean, this is it. It's complicated. You don't want to do or find yourselves in another regulatory breach not related to financial crime because you've disclosed something that can't be done. It's about building that wider culture of people just happy to have conversations with compliance, seeing compliance as actually the people who hold the keys to let them go through the doors they want to go through, rather than being the gatekeeper stopping them doing what they want to do.
Exactly that. And John, from a Credas point of view, I know you've helped quite a lot of our clients, haven't you? With their auditing and whatnot as well. So we as a business see a dramatic difference in how our clients approach source of funds, don't we? Especially the difference, for example, between an estate agent and a law firm, but even in each sector that is very different. Different clients do different things. Like, what are the gaps that you've spotted since you've been working with us, with the different processes, with the different clients that we deal with?
Well, yeah, different clients do have different approaches to source of funds, and a lot of it's based around risk assessment and, you know, what their risk appetite is around things. But the fundamental obligations remain the same. I mean, I don't know if either of you gentlemen have had the privilege of an SRA audit. Yeah. And what was really striking to me was the search for rationale. You know, they want rationale documented. They want to understand why the fee earner, why the matter principal came to the decision that they did, that these funds were okay. And I think as long as the fee earner could sit up in a doc, for example, and explain that, why they came to that decision, and most importantly, that it was written down and documented, then yeah, that's what really brings the whole process together. It's what brings the evidence to life. It's what makes the relationship and the transaction make sense and align with the due diligence that you've done. And I think that's the most common theme that is lacking, you know, is sometimes documenting that rationale and really making that clear rather than just sticking the bank statement on file, you know.
And I think, again, going back to I'm in a privileged position where I've got a team of people to help that, and the fee earners have got a team of people to help with that. For the firms out there that are, you know, they are the fee earner, they are the compliance person, or, you know, are very small practices that are also the MLROs as well, to go, if I could boil it down into very simple steps to follow, it's what did you do, why did you do it, and what did it show you? I don't think the Law Society or SRA expect War and Peace here, but they expect to see a methodical approach to say, I considered these factors, I reached this conclusion, and then here's what I did with that outcome. And that, in a simple case, could be 3 sentences, or in a very complex case, it could be an entire page. The amount that you document as well should be proportionate to the steps that you practically did. So if you did loads, write loads. If you did very little, write very little. I don't think it needs to be academic or, you know, particularly good prose or anything like that. It just needs to be practical to say, here's what I did and why I did it and what did it tell me and how am I going to move on from that.
It's that word, it's proportionate, you know, and it's about, because it can go the other way, can't it? I mean, you're talking about commercial pressures and things like that, but also, you know, clients have a right not to be investigated unduly or in a disproportionate manner, you know, and yeah, it's about asking the right questions at outset, so you're taking a proportionate risk-based approach to the due diligence that you're performing, yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we've talked quite a lot about bank statements. I feel like we're picking on bank statements today. And we've said, you know, just getting 6 months worth of bank statements is just a box ticking exercise. But what is the sort of difference from just box ticking to actually understanding why you're getting those statements and what you're looking for? You know, so what's the difference between, I've got 6 months worth of bank statements, as you mentioned earlier, job done, compared to really looking into those statements and seeing, I suppose the next stage then is the source of wealth, isn't it, from those statements?
I think the key word there is at source, or Rhian, it's around the origin of your funds. And 6 months of bank statement just shows you the funds are there for 6 months. They don't show you the source of that is. You can get one bank statement from 5 months ago. Okay, might choose to get today's bank statement as well. But if you're seeing, like on a reasonable risk-based approach, if you're seeing the same values from 5 months ago as today, well, actually, you see a big payment coming in 5 months ago. You have to look at that channel then. You have to go down there, you have to understand, is it an inheritance from granny who's passed away and all of this? Is it a big bonus in relation to this? Is it a big sale? And chasing down those avenues to understand more generally, well, actually, this is why it all makes sense. Build the picture, build the story from the documents you have put in there. And this goes back to more generally around client matter risk assessment. Box ticking doesn't help. Build the story. You don't get that from a tick box exercise. You get it from a note that explains where and why and gives you that defensibility in terms of someone looking at it 2 years down the line and saying, well, why?
Yeah. And I suppose, where do we stop? So, you know, if the source did come from a big bonus or a sale of shares in a business, do you then need to get proof of that bonus, proof of that shares, you know, and then if it was sale of shares in a business, more about that business, like where do you stop, I suppose, on...
That needs to be driven by your, excuse me, that needs to be driven by your risk assessment. Because if you go back to the source of why we need to do these things, the money laundering regulations, generally speaking, under the Regulation 28 for due diligence, there is not a reference to having to do source of funds checks outside of ongoing monitoring. Now, yes, we need to do it in order to do a good client and matter risk assessment, because as we've said, so much of the risk is related to where the money's coming from. So you really have to go back to when does it need to come in, and really that is exclusively an EDD. You do have to gather some information, you know, to tick other boxes, but I know we're avoiding the box ticking question here, but it's about understanding the source, as we've already covered off, but then understanding the risk to be able to set that bar of going, well, if it's very, very low risk and the client's explanation has all made sense and there's nothing else here to really worry about, why would I force the client to do extra stuff? Why would I force myself to do extra stuff when it's not proportionate? But if there's lots of risk factors and there's lots of opportunity where this is increasing the likelihood that your client is a money launderer, not saying that they are one, but it's increasing the chances that they are because they're in a high-risk jurisdiction, they're in a high-risk industry, they're doing a high-risk transaction type, the funding sources are typically higher risk, then absolutely you need to be throwing everything in the kitchen sink at that. So for me, I'm not going to be able to say stop here, but it has to be where is the source, what is the risk, and then what is reasonable to you to be able to say confidently, if you were up on the stand, to say, yes, I'm happy that I understand that where this money came from, and I can show you that.
I think the wider piece around source of funds and conveyancing goes back to what the government sees as being the big risks here, and certainly affecting the legal sector at the moment. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the risk assessment, like that's the client matter risk assessment, but it's also your practice-wide risk assessment, and it's the sectoral risk assessment, and it's the national risk assessment. And if you're looking at those, well, national risk assessment and sectoral risk assessment both says conveyancing is high risk, so you want to be taking that on an appropriate way. Now, where it starts at high risk is one thing, it's how you triage it down within your internal mitigations and your policies, controls and procedures to build out, well actually, this is why what we're doing is reasonable, this is why it's defensible in the circumstances. And the more you get that kind of buy-in from people understanding that actually we're doing this for the right thing, we're trying to stop financial crime here, generally you will see dividends in the long run from that.
And John, there's a lot of noise in our sector right now about how we can automate source of funds using technology such as ours. Do you ever think there will be a point where we can absolutely automate it all, or will we always need a human to eye it up and make sure it's giving us, you know, the right answers?
I think personally the regs are designed very much in a way to promote that human intervention and that scrutiny of evidence, that interpretation of the risks and the evidence and the transaction that you've got at hand. And where automation and the technology really helps, I think, is gathering the evidence, you know, and collating that evidence, presenting it. Open banking, of course, you know, is so helpful rather than going back and forth requesting reams of bank statements. You know, you might go 6 months back and then you'll see a transaction that you need to look into further. And another really important point, I think, is the reliance you can place on the evidence that you've got in front of you. So you might see transactions on a bank statement and not be familiar with the payer. So you need to do a little bit of due diligence into the payer, you know, and find out who is this organisation that's paying money into my client's bank account. And I think it's those kind of steps, it's the scrutiny that will always require that manual intervention. But yeah, in terms of evidence gathering, in terms of the initial questions that you ask, automated technology forms and capturing that first layer that's going to inform the next step is is something that technology can help with massively, you know, and really streamline processes. I mean, it's come a long way since I was an MLRO in conveyancing, certainly. And yeah, I think there's great options out there now. Some of the reporting that you can get on bank statements that will highlight unusual transactions for you. And it's picking out each entry on that bank statement, because like you said, you know, if you've got a bank statement on file going back 6 months, that needs to be scrutinised and because otherwise you're exposing that file to questions that haven't been answered. But yeah, it's a balancing act, you know, and like the FCA have said for a long time, there's no silver bullet when it comes to AML. And I think that balance and proportionality does require human involvement, you know.
Effectively, it's know your client, and you can't automate knowing your client when that is built up from conversations that have happened over 3 months in terms of a conveyancing transaction. You have to be able to build that into what you've obtained over that 3-month period makes sense in the long run to be able to establish clean accumulation of wealth, clean accumulation of funds, whichever way you might want to approach it. But that's it. You can't automate that. Technology can't supplement that, but you can supplement what you are doing with technology.
I think also a crucial part of this, you know, is it's down to the relevant person, and the regs are so, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of responsibility upon fee earners on the matter principle. They're the one who's potentially looking at these offences under the Proceeds of Crime Act. You know, they're the ones that face independent liability for anything that goes wrong with these offences under POCA, and that's them as an individual, you know, and you can't outsource those obligations to technology. You can't outsource that responsibility on that one human being in that critical role with the visibility that they have of everything as a whole, and as has been said, that holistic approach, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to a point where, yeah, absolutely we'll drive down the amount of hours that are getting wasted on some of this stuff, and we'll get it down, I think, you know, 90-95%. But I think the key thing is, even now, even forgetting tech for a second, you can outsource. You can outsource the responsibility. Someone else can do the work for you. But the absolute hard stop is you can outsource the risk or accountability. Yeah. The buck absolutely stops with someone, and that will always be a person. So I think we can get very, very close to eliminating it, but we'll never entirely do away with it unless the government decide that they no longer want to do this stuff. But that's wishful thinking, I think. Yeah.
And on that note, I suppose, you know, we're talking about wider law here, but in conveyancing in general, it is high volume, fast pace. You know, like you said earlier, commercially, you know, it's a fixed price. So, Mike, how do you stop sort of in the conveyancing world, source of funds becoming sort of a mechanical job rather than, you know, a risk approach, you know, rather than looking at each case differently, I suppose, and with clear eyes, rather than it just becoming a process and, we've said tick boxing. But if you're doing hundreds of conveyancing cases, or it's pretty much like working on a production line, you know, so how do you stop it from becoming mechanical?
I mean, we've sort of leaned into the idea of it being a mechanical process. So what we've tried to do is remove as much as we can the decision making and the risk assessment as possible from the fee earner. And what we've said to them is, we need you to gather this information at the start. We need you to plug that into a client and matter risk assessment, which principally is a bit box ticky, you know, but it prompts the fee earner to answer factual based questions based on the facts as they know them for the conveyance. And then there's a combination of system triggers and the central team reviewing it, we interpret all those results to do the risk assessment for them. It's a bit like kind of a sports team, you know, it's having the right player in the right position at the right time to know, I'm doing this bit over here and I'm doing that well, and I know when I pass the ball to someone else, they're going to be where I need them to be and doing the thing that I need them to do. So yeah, we've kept a bit of the box ticky thing, but realising that we're never going to completely eliminate we're never going to completely get the fee earners on the side of, actually really going and interpreting all this, because they do have so many other competing priorities to go. So if you can give us the facts, we'll interpret those facts for you, and then we'll pass you back tangible instructions for you to go away in action. And that seems to work for us.
And Luke, where does the sort of source of funds sit within the wider AML picture? You know, is it just when it's high risk, or you know, or is that a misconception? Where does the source of funds sit within the overall sort of process of AML?
I mean, if you look at the law, there's no de minimis in this at all. You need to be looking at it in the wider context of, well, actually, what is money laundering? Money laundering is the movement of funds itself, and that is inherently what you're doing here. And if you're trying to nip it in the bud of stopping money laundering, stopping financial crime, source of funds is the key place to look at that. Your ID&V, you can know who your client is. That's super simple comparative to knowing where their money has come from on this £500,000 transaction and establishing why that all makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you need to do something about it. For me, it's the pinnacle. That is anti-financial crime in the wider sense. It's understanding where the funds have come from, whether that is your high cash-intensive businesses, whether it is proliferation finance and dual-use goods, sanctions more generally. All of this feeds into the wider, where did it come from? What do we understand about the transaction?
It's like a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? And you're just placing all of the pieces in the right order. But when does source of funds become source of wealth then? Is that something that you do on every case, that you know you go as far as the wealth source, or is source of funds just okay? When does it transition?
I mean, I think source of funds and source of wealth, if you were to look at them on a Venn diagram, there's significant overlap. You can't understand the economic origins of the money that's coming in for a specific transaction without, working out at least a part of the wealth. You might not have all of the wealth picture, but you'll get a good proportion of it for the money that you're taking custody of. For me, source of wealth is an entirely different beast in of itself. And while you could probably answer wealth questions in relation to source of funds, source of wealth for me is really reserved for your very, very high risk under law. We've got to do it for politically exposed persons, but source of wealth for me is that bit around understanding all of the wealth, not just the source of the money that's coming in, and that's the key difference for me. You need to separate the two as two distinct things, but recognise that you'll get a little bit of one from the other.
Yeah, agree entirely with that.
Yeah, it aligns very much with the profile, isn't it? It's about the whole profile of that client. It's the information on the payer, and yeah, it's a more enhanced source of funds check, really, isn't it? And understanding a lot more about the client in general.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at a very simple example of a young person, first-time buyer coming into the, trying to get on the property ladder, and all of their money comes from, savings from their part-time job or full-time job, and the rest of their money is coming from a bank loan, bank of mum and dad, or a mortgage. You can effectively say the Venn diagram there is completely overlapped, because the source of their money is entirely their source of wealth. But if you go up to a very complex end, and you've got someone who's buying another property when they've got a massive portfolio of properties already sitting in the background, then the Venn diagram's much more separated, because you're worried about the money for this one property, which might glean into, well, their money comes from other properties. But source of wealth for me, if you were doing that in its truest form, that would be actually sitting down and saying, well, how many properties do you own, and where are they, and what's the value of them, and how much capital have you got in all those properties to actually sit and say this person is X wealthy. But that's, again, very, very much, that's probably at the most intrusive end of what we need to do. So really should be reserved for
enhanced due diligence.
Yeah.
And when that's called for as well.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the risk assessment, your risk assessment will highlight when EDD needs to be done, doesn't it? So, well, and John, from an audit point of view, like an audit trail, how are we, auditing? Well, how can we create an audit trail for source of funds? What does a good audit trail look like?
Yeah, well, It starts with the client and matter risk assessment, and I think it's really helpful to have a space on that pro forma to where you can explain, like you said, in a few lines, just a bit of rationale about where the funds have come from. And then you want to be able to link that to the documentary evidence supporting it, and crucially, you want to be seeing the account that you're getting paid from. You want to make sure that you know where you're expecting to receive that money from, so that if you do get a payment, and I think this is a part that's quite crucial, and I don't know if you guys reconcile payments that you get into the client account to make sure that money came from the bank account that you were expecting it to come from. But that's a crucial link as well, I think, and to be able to tie that together. So yeah, the funds did come from where we were expecting, and we didn't get a random payment at the last minute into the client account. And again, firms take that to different levels. Some will perform that reconciliation, some won't, because it is very onerous. That's a whole nother task that you've got to add onto the chain of other tasks that you need to do. But yeah, it's the record keeping requirements are very clear under the regs, and that's a crucial part of it. It's a well documented matter risk assessment. It's documentary evidence on file that's been scrutinised and that supports the rationale or the explanations and the information that you've obtained about the origin of those funds.
I think the difficult thing sometimes is you can't look over the shoulder of each and every one of your fee earners and everything that they are doing across all of their matters, but it's building in the right controls, processes, procedures more generally to support them in that aspect. Whenever we get funds come in, the lawyer gets an email about that, and they are reminded to put a source of funds note on place on their file related to that as well. That's what we do as a firm to protect ourselves. We are engaging them to protect themselves, but we can't sit over their shoulder every single time. But that's it. It's ensuring that you do everything you can to support people at the business end of what they're doing.
Exactly that, I think. And I think the final question to wrap this up is for you, Mike. Do you think the technology is reducing the friction with source of funds?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly. I'm going on almost 20 years of doing this, and I remember sitting way back when and poring over pages and pages and pages of bank statements, and with my highlighter out and going back and having to draft questions and things. Where now, I mean, you don't even necessarily need to use open banking, but you've got tools at your disposal now that can summarise bank statements for you, pull out red flags, and AI is going to be hugely effective in this space as well. I mean, it already is, but that's just going to go from strength to strength. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, tools are really driving down the hours spent doing this stuff. But again, I think it's probably at the moment very limited to the mainstream. When your outliers come in where it is a little bit odd or unusual, it's not helpful there, but it's not intended to be helpful there. It's intended to hit the mass, time drains. But yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, guys, for joining me today. And that's the end of this episode.